Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation, and also the Good Question Podcast. I have a returning guest, Ken McCarthy. Ken is a very exceptional person. He has devoted many, many years of his life to uncovering all kinds of corruption, the evil that men do under the sun, essentially. Ken finds it, exposes it, writes about it. He has a website called Brass Check. Just literally almost every single day, he comes out with another scandal, another historic issue that came up that was covered up or not described accurately or misrepresented. Frankly, it's amazing. Over the past 4 years, he's written a number of books, such as The Real Anthony Fauci. He's been a co-author and an author of various books about COVID and all the terrible things that have gone on. His recent book is called What the Nurses Saw. I just got it in the mail a day or so ago. It's like almost a 500-page tome with probably about 100 references, conversations with various nurses that were involved in COVID, what they directly saw and experienced. It's pretty frightening what's happened. So I think today's interview is going to be very revealing, very scary. And as I always tell Ken, I don't know how he stands to look at all this evil and still continue doing what he does. Thank God for what he does. Welcome, Ken. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And I'll confess, it's getting harder. And I'm just going to tell you a true story to get started. As a result of putting this book out, I've been invited to be on a bunch of calls, what they call medical justice calls, with family members of victims. And I spent several hours listening to story after story after story. And when I hung up, I went to the bathroom and threw up. Yeah, I just, and I'm not that kind of guy, but I just threw up. What can I tell you? So this stuff is dark. And by the way, the book that I wrote was called Fauci's First Fraud, and Kennedy cited it. The film that I made that the book is based on, my film came out in 2020, and he cited it 28 times in his 2021 book. Just minor detail. And the new book.
I caught myself. So you were a co-author essentially, or at least cited.
Well, don't let it. He'll be pissed off if I'm called a co-author. I will say, there were a lot of people that contributed to the book. That was a big book too. If that book had been laid out in the normal way with normal margins and normal typeface and normal paper, it would have been about 1,000 pages long. It would have been the size of the Manhattan phone book. But there were a lot of people. It wasn't just me, but I will say this. He made a decision mid-course to change the tone of the book. And I think he devoted 5 chapters to Fauci's AIDS fraud. And that was an inspiration for me and a journalist named Celia Farber. But today's book is What the Nurses Saw. And this is a big one. You want me to dive in? And
yeah, tell me how did the idea come to you? Was it sparked by conversations, and what path did the book take? Let's start with that.
Okay, well, if people remember, back in May of 2020, remember now, we're going back to the beginning of all this stuff, 2 nurses stepped up and said they are killing people. They're flat out killing them. These were not hysterical nurses. These were not novice nurses. These were veteran. One of them literally a combat veteran from Iraq. Okay. The other one, a woman who is a certified air ambulance. In other words, somebody's wrecked in a mountain and you can't even get an ambulance to them. They fly in a helicopter. You got to be a really good trauma nurse to get and keep a job like that. She also has worked in field hospitals in Syria. All right. So we're talking hardcore women here, and they were both on social media on YouTube. They got a little bit of attention and then they were censored and ignored. And I kept up with them and I thought, okay, someone's going to pick up on this story. And I waited, and 2020 passed, and none of these nonprofits that had collect millions of dollars to supposedly fight the resistance did anything. None of these investigative reporters have done anything. So I thought, okay, maybe 2021, someone will pick up this story. No. 2022? 2022? Anybody? 2022? Nope. 2023? Nope. So at the very beginning of the summer, I said, okay, I guess I got to do it. So I interviewed 8, including Nicole and including Erin Marie. She's got one of these long names I can never pronounce. Nurse Erin Marie. I interviewed those two, and I interviewed 6 other veteran nurses, nurses with anywhere from 10. One of them has 40 years of experience and has a PhD and is a nursing educator. So these were not lightweights. And so they're in there. I have an extended interview with a respiratory therapist, and we will talk about what that means and why that's significant. And then I had an extended interview with a great follow the money gal. Oh my God. She makes Sherlock Holmes look like he hasn't gotten out of his hammock yet. I mean, she is unbelievable. We have a lot of appendix material. We have technical but comprehensible material about remdesivir, about ventilators and intubation, and all other topics that were needed to flesh out the book. It did weigh in at 500 pages. I don't know. I see 489, but for some reason Amazon says it's 500. I won't argue with them. But so that's what's in the book. And that's why I wrote the book, because literally, Rich, nobody else is touching this topic. There have been some, like one-offs, like, there's a guy named Scott Sherrar, and his daughter, who had a disability, went into a hospital with minor respiratory, really minor, and came out in a body bag. And there have been some other individual cases where families talk about the individual case, but nothing that shows comprehensively how this was nationwide, system-wide.
Quick question here. I've heard you talk about various people that, again, appear to do what you do, but I guess once they get recognition and all that, they seem to either fold or turn corrupt, or I don't know. What do you think happens to people?
Let's talk about the investigative reporters. They just, and I'm not going to mention the guy's name, but for instance, they just want to, Twitter released its files, and this guy's basically making a handsome living reading the Twitter files to you. Okay, legit. I did write him in 2020 and said this is an unfolding catastrophe, and he kind of talked to me a little bit, and then he stopped answering my emails. Then there's another one, won't mention her name, but she'll do things like read the back pages of a Wall Street Journal report on the Epstein debacle and sort of interpret them for you. And that, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know what these people are doing. I'm running, me, I'm running 2 businesses. I got some other stuff I'm doing. I'm supporting some original research in neuroscience and rehabilitative medicine. Like, I'm a busy guy, and all the stuff I'm doing, I'm squeezing into all the other stuff I'm doing. I don't know what these investigative reporters are doing. I honestly don't know what the freaking hell they're doing. And as for the people collecting money, millions of dollars every year to fight the COVID fraud, it just seemed they all seem like closed shops. If you're not one of their best buddies, you're not getting on their their radar. You're not, and they know who I am. Believe me, they know exactly who I am. So I go figure. I don't get it. I don't care anymore. My book is out. It's on Amazon. It's doing well. I'm on your show. I'm going to be on some other shows. I got these nurses now behind the book, but it's not about me. It's not about the book. It's about what's in the book. And if you mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's in the book.
Yes, let's go. Sure.
I think I've already ranted and raved a little bit that this story is absolutely untold. There is no article, there is no blog post, there is no, whatever you call those things where people talk podcasts. There's no books. There is nothing that attempts to show comprehensively what happened and how many people were flat out murdered. And a lot of people have said, oh, that's an awfully strong word, Ken. Guess what? That's the word these veteran nurses are using, and that's the word the victims are using. And if people actually read the book, they will see that murder is kind of, I don't know what else you call it. What else do you call it when you know you are doing something that is likely to end somebody's life and you do it anyway, repeatedly, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, which brings us to the other important point. This is not over, Rich. They are still killing people in hospitals under cover of COVID.
Well, actually, it's worse than murder. It's premeditated murder, and it's actually being a serial killer.
Well, they are this system that they have set up, and the useful idiots who are continuing. I don't fault anybody in the early weeks or months who, when they were told to hang a bag of remdesivir, gave patients remdesivir. I don't fault anybody for that, because they were told this is an emergency. Here's the solution. Here's the new drug. Okay, not going to fault anybody in the beginning, but all these months and years later, anybody that's still doing this, I'm going to call it, you're a murderer. Okay. All right. So this book was written for 3 audiences. One, the families of victims, and the victims, because there are some people that they failed to kill who somehow survived this meat grinder. They are out and their health is absolutely destroyed. So this happened one at a time in the dark. which is why nobody knows about it. The nurses came out and they tried to tell us. Nobody listened to them, all right? The families are, as you can imagine, are destroyed. They've lost their husband. They've lost their wife. They've lost their son. They've lost their daughter. Some of them are financially destroyed because they lost their breadwinner. They're traumatized. They either don't really understand what happened or they know what happened, but they can't believe it happened and they think they're crazy or they're being told they're crazy. So that's how this thing was pulled off, in the dark, one at a time. Because right now, we've got the Likud party in Israel and, the criminal Benjamin Netanyahu. Every country's entitled to defend itself. This has gone way beyond normal, but it's happening in broad daylight. Everyone can see it. This was happening in the dark. And by the way, they were, my estimate, I'm going to get to where I can get these numbers. They were killing at least as many people in the hospitals as are being killed in Gaza right now at the rate of 10,000 a month. Okay. Let's go to these numbers so everybody understands. This is a rough number, right? Because nobody knows the exact number, but 1 million people are said to have died of COVID in America. Okay, that's the number they've given us. That's their number. 92% of those people, 900,000 and change, died in a U.S. hospital. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah. So that's just starting there. We had the highest rate of death. I mean, there may have been some other wackadoodle European countries or Commonwealth countries, but if you look at, Africa, Asia, South America, Central America, we had good Asian countries like Japan and Taiwan. We had the highest death rate from COVID by far. Now, many people have discussed this issue did they die from COVID or did they die with COVID? There is a third category. Did they die from neglect, abuse, or malfeasance in a hospital? Now, how do we get to that number? I'll be honest with you, I don't know. But here's the numbers that we need to know. We need to know how many of the people who died were given or forced on remdesivir. There probably, I know there is an answer to that question. It requires a research staff much bigger than me.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show.
Well, I thought the first major killer was ventilators, and then remdesivir was also a killer, but what else was a killer if you were to list them maybe in a Pareto order?
Well, so remdesivir. Let me just finish this, and then I'll answer that question. We need to know how many people were given remdesivir, and we need to know what percentage of them died. We need to know how many people were put on a ventilator, and we need to know what percentage of them died. We don't have these numbers yet, but here's what I can tell you. I've written a book, and that's opened the door, as I mentioned earlier in the call, for me to be invited to speak to basically survivor groups, medical justice groups. And so I have heard story after story after story after story. And in fact, I want to give a shout out to a group. They have a terrible URL. I'm going to try to help them. It's called CMHCHBMP. CH like chocolate, BMP like bump minus the U, chbmp.org. They have over 1,000 video testimonials from families about what happened to their loved ones, including photographs. The condition some of these bodies were in after these so-called treatments is beyond belief. Last night I spoke to one woman when the funeral home called her and said, "What happened to your husband? His stomach was open and he's missing organs." I mean, this is so unhinged, but it's a lot of testimonies. The other thing this group, chbmp.org, did is they studied all the reports and they came up with 25 commonalities. In other words, stories that come up again and again and again and again. So I want to tell you, now I want to say one other thing because it's so important. We need justice for these families. And justice may simply be an acknowledgement that, yes, your loved one was murdered. You're not crazy and it's not going to be allowed to stay in the dark. That may be the only justice we can ever give them. unless somehow we can figure out how plaintiff attorneys can go after these people. But that's a whole other issue. That's one audience. Then the next thing, Rich, though, is even though they're not killing as many people as they used to because there aren't as many COVID diagnoses, I have to say this with absolute emphasis and clarity. If anybody goes into a hospital and is diagnosed as COVID and is somehow kept by that hospital, you are in grave danger. And I'm going to explain why that is in a second in detail and what you need to watch out for. The third thing I want to say is they have created a system for mass murder off radar that they can flip the switch and turn on again at any time. That's why it is so, yes. That's why, well, think about it. You and I are talking about this. How many people realize that hospitals have a protocol in place that they can literally murder people and get away with it? And a lot of people are listening to this saying, this man is out of his mind. He's unhinged. He's crazy. You got to read the book. You have to listen to the nurses, 8 of them, veteran nurses. You have to read the 20-year veteran respiratory therapist to understand the depth of this. But I want to explain how they do it, and this will show everybody will get it as soon as I explain this. You'll also get how to protect yourself. You'll also get that they can fire up this machine with a new disease at any moment and kill a whole nother batch of people.
What is a quick sketch of the protocol?
Okay, let me explain the whole thing. You go to the hospital and you say you're not feeling well. They give you a COVID test, but with oximeter, what do they call that thing where you measure?
Pulse oximeter. Yes, it measures your oxygen.
Gives you a pulse oximeter, and then it's not that bad, So they send you home. No treatment, no advice, no nothing. They're hoping the case gets worse so that when you come back, you've got a bad reading and you've got a positive COVID test. Okay? Now you're sick. And they say, hey, let's put you on oxygen. What do you call that thing? The under the nose. It's got a weird name.
Oh, cannula, like a nasal.
Yeah, cannula. Let's give you a little oxygen. The minute they give you oxygen and you have a COVID diagnosis, or a positive COVID test, which we know is absolute bullshit. The minute they give you that, you are now a candidate for remdesivir, and they start pushing remdesivir on you hard. Now, some people already know that remdesivir is very dangerous. A lot of people do not. Remdesivir was a drug developed for Ebola. It failed, didn't help anybody, and it caused a lot of organ damage. And based on, I have the data, it's in the book. I mean, they tested, the maker of remdesivir did, I think, 2 months or 6 weeks of clinical trials and declared in a paper, not peer-reviewed, that it was fine. And Fauci, we have the video on our website, whatthenursessaw.com, in April said, this is the cure, this is it, we're going with this, there ain't going to be nothing else. Okay, that thing was not available for peer review until October of 2020. So I don't know how many months that is, but April to October. Okay, all right. So you come in, you're a little worried, you're having a little trouble breathing, you got a positive COVID test, they give you a cannula, you're getting a little oxygen. Hey, you should probably get this brand new whiz-bang drug, remdesivir. And if you say no, now they're going to write you down as being agitated. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm laying the whole thing out for you. You're agitated. So they'll say, and maybe you have maybe you're concerned, maybe you're afraid, maybe you're terrified. Maybe the last 3 years of nonstop terror propaganda has, set you up to go into panic when you're starting to have a breathing problem. There is a case, it's in the book, of a man in his mid-30s or early 30s in one of these New York City hospitals, public hospitals. He came in with what was clearly a panic attack. They intubated and they killed him. Okay. He didn't have COVID. He didn't have a fever. He didn't have a cough. He was just having trouble breathing because he was scared out of his mind because of all the news reports. All right. So let me get back to how they're killing people so that this is crystal clear. So you're having trouble. You're out of breath. You're maybe weak. You're feverish. You think it's COVID. You go to the hospital. They give you a little oxygen. Then they say, hey, would you like something to help you calm down? And they give you one of a battery of sedatives they're giving these patients. Once they've given you a sedative, you are now somebody who is eligible to be kept in the hospital against your will.
Really?
Yeah, because you are now on paper a potential risk to yourself or others because you have a psychiatric disorder which required the prescribing of an anti-anxiety medication. Okay? Yeah. So now, if they can't get you to get remdesivir and they can't get, and then the goal, by the way, they're paid to put you on remdesivir. Okay. And it's not just, hey, one bag. If they can get you to go through an entire course of remdesivir, they get a large bonus. I'm sorry that I have the book handy, but it's 500 pages and I have to look it up, but I don't want to stop.
I remember hearing remdesivir was like $6,000 a treatment or something. Very, very expensive.
That sounds about right. And that's what they get paid. And it doesn't cost them that much. So there's a profit margin. What that profit margin is, I do not know, but it is free money for them. So they got to get you through the whole course to get the big check. And they ran several patients through multiple courses, and they rang the cash register every time. And what the nurses said, and that's the title of the book, what the nurses saw, you can go with whatthenursessaw.com, is the veteran nurses, they did hang those bags originally and put them in the IVs. They saw that the organ damage immediately. They knew right away. That's why Nicole Sorotek, one of the original whistleblowers, was thrown out of the hospitals in New York City because she refused to administer remdesivir to patients once she realized what was going on. Okay, so now they want to get you on remdesivir because there's a payday. They also want to get you on a ventilator because there's a payday for that. What I didn't know till I talked to the nurses is there was a special payday if they kept you on the ventilator for more than 96 hours. Okay, now I have in this book a 20-year veteran with a respiratory therapist, 20-year record, sterling record, and he is unequivocal. The goal of a respirator, of a ventilator, is to get you off it as soon as humanly possible. You do not want to keep somebody on a ventilator 1 minute longer than they need to be on. Why? Because it is so destructive to the body. The way we normally breathe with our diaphragm. Our lungs are doing stuff, but it's the diaphragm that's doing all the work. If your diaphragm starts working, you have no method to get air into your lungs anymore. It's over. You're dead. All right. When somebody is in that extreme condition, that's when ventilation makes sense. And in ventilation, they're basically pumping the air into your lungs through your larynx, through your windpipe. And it has to be monitored very carefully because under the best of circumstances, you run a risk of shearing the lungs. Our lungs were not meant to get oxygen or get air fluid that way. Okay, so they're working really hard to get you on remdesivir. They're working really hard to get you on a ventilator. And some of the things they would do to get people on ventilators is they put them on BiPAP. This is a face mask. Okay, it is in cases where it was not necessary, where the cannula was enough, they'd put you on the BiPAP. That is uncomfortable. It's anxiety producing. It's stress provoking. And I've heard more than one case where they would crank up the airflow so that it wasn't helping. It was making things worse. At which point they'd come to you and say, you know what? You're in grave danger. If you're not ventilated, you're going to die.
Horrible.
Yeah. Now they've already put you on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different psych meds. Right? You're half out of it. You're in complete terror. You can't breathe. And you have this kindly doctor leaning. And we have a video. I don't know how NBC, I guess they didn't even realize. We have a video that NBC put out and we captured, and it's on our website, that shows a doctor lying to a patient. She said to the patient, well, you'll get out of here much faster if we vent you, and everything will be fine. Well, our expert, 20 years, respiratory therapist. By the way, these guys do 4 years of schooling for this. And then they have clinical experience before they're allowed to touch a patient. And by the way, unless you're a pulmonologist, you don't really know fuck all, pardon my French, about how to run a ventilator.
Yeah.
Even ICU doctors really don't know how to do it. And even ICU nurses don't know how to do it. It's a specialty. So anyway, they would talk people and they would basically, the folks have been terrorized. They get to the hospital and now they're being run through this gauntlet of additional terror. And why? Oh, let's talk about money. Why? Because they're going to get paid for the remdesivir per course. They're going to get paid to keep somebody on the respirator 96 hours, even if they could have gotten off in 24, assuming they ever needed to be on it at all. Let's talk about something else. We've all heard about ivermectin and other therapies, the vitamin D, which every hospital has, the vitamin C, which every hospital has. Those were forbidden, right? Those were forbidden protocols. I didn't know. I bet you didn't know. I bet 99.9% of our listeners didn't know. Ibuprofen was prohibited if you were a COVID patient.
Yeah, for a while, I remember they said, I don't even know if they did paracetamol, but they did at least ibuprofen. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Ibuprofen is a standard treatment for inflammation. It's a standard for inflammation with respiratory distress. There's another tried and true multi-decade therapy for these kinds of problems, steroids. Right? And those were also prohibited. So in addition to all the other things they did, they prohibited the two things that could have helped, the two plain vanilla things, we wouldn't even go to the ivermectin world, right? We'll just talk about the standard things they used to do all the time. Those things were prohibited. So people that were sick got sicker, and as they got sicker, they were given, here's some oxygen. Oh, here's some barbiturates. Boy, you're not doing very well. We need to intubate you. And would you like some remdesivir with that?
No, there was also nebulizers too. You need a prescription to get one. And they were like, oh, don't put salt water and peroxide in it. It's dangerous. And that's another thing that, in my family, we've personally used. We got a prescription for it. It was all legit, but it helped with breathing symptoms, for other conditions, about 15, 20% within 5 minutes. Nothing wrong with that.
Rich, literally anything that worked and was known to work for decades was prohibited. And when I say prohibited, if you were a nurse in a COVID wing, and we're going to talk about what a COVID wing is in a second, and you wanted ibuprofen for a patient, you were told no. And if you forced the issue, your job was threatened. And many of the good nurses, I wanted to say something that's really important. Many nurses good ones just got fired or were thrown out right away. There were some other nurses, and unfortunately it's a small percentage, but there were some other nurses who stayed on to try to mitigate the harm, including sneaking ivermectin to patients, including coordinating with families to get their loved ones out of the hospital. Some of these nurses were willing, I can almost weep, were willing to take this vaccine that they know was bullshit and dangerous so they could stay and try to help these patients. Okay? Yeah. Now, let's talk about a COVID wing, all right? They set up all these, a lot of these hospitals turned into COVID only, right? If you had, if you needed chemo, if you had a heart attack, if you had a broken leg, maybe with a broken leg is an exaggeration, but almost, if you were a pregnant woman that needed the prenatal care, you were out of luck. You couldn't go to some of these hospitals because they were COVID only. All right. And then here's part of the system. And this system, I think the reason this has not come out is nobody has seen it in all its, all the different gears. The other thing they did was do a blanket, no liability, pure immunity. Right. The second thing they did was say, all those laws we have about, doctors needing to be from America and nurses needing to be from America and having the right doctor in the right place at the right time, just throw all that stuff out. I think it was Nicole told me, in these ICU units, they had obstetricians, they had gynecologists, they had podiatrists, they had guys that had never been in an ICU in their life running ICUs. This was not uncommon. The other thing they did, and this shocked me, I had heard that they had nurses right out of school. Like they got their degree and they just put them in the ICUs. This means they had no clinical experience of any kind or any significant kind, and they had no ICU experience of any kind. And these young nurses were being put in charge of intubated patients, of caring for intubated patients. Because, it's not just a matter of getting that pipe down their throat, which, by the way, the slang for that in the hospitals is called the garden hose. If people don't understand how serious this thing is, right? And not only is it hard to do this correctly without injuring somebody, because you got to get that down their throat to their lung. You also have to get a feeding tube to their stomach. You have to do it correctly without injuring them. You can kill them if you do it wrong, and there were patients killed by people that didn't know what they were doing who did it wrong. But once, assuming you've set it up correctly, those patients need to be monitored very, very carefully.
Right, yeah.
Okay? That didn't happen. Because you had, for instance, some of these stories blend together. It was either Nicole or it was Erin Marie. She said they had one respiratory therapist for 300 patients. It's supposed to be 4 to 8, okay? You also had residents. Now, resident means you got your MD and you have no freaking experience at all, but you got your MD. They had residents running these COVID wards, okay? And the supervising physicians sometimes came in, sometimes didn't. Now, I've been told that occasionally there were some good supervising physicians that, did what they could, okay? But sometimes the supervising physicians did not even show up, and you had residents that didn't know their ass from their elbow running ICUs and telling these veteran nurses, no, you're wrong. Do it my way. This is the common story. So let's, rewind this and look at everything. You come in, if you have any oxygen saturation, you're having trouble breathing, you have a positive COVID test, you're in. They put you on sedatives. They put a BiPAP on you. By the way, no care, no compassion, no holding your hand, no explaining anything. And if you acted like you were a little concerned, you were written down as agitated, and then they opened the floodgates of sedatives, and then they started pushing the remdesivir on you. They started pushing the intubation on you. Since sometimes they give somebody remdesivir, their organs would start to fail, and they'd say, wow, you're really sick. We need to intubate you right away. You're going to die. Right? Now, here's the question. Who was doing this? Again,
So I was going to ask you, who came up with this and was orchestrating it?
let's talk about that in a second, but let's talk about who was pulling the triggers on this, who was actually in those wards doing this work. Because remember, they gave blanket immunity, and they also waived the normal laws for who could be work in a U.S. hospital and who couldn't. Never in the history of America have physicians from other countries been given just a blanket invitation to come to the United States and practice medicine. I'm sure if we've got any doctors on here from other countries, they know they could have been the best doctor in their country. They come to the U.S. and they're working as a janitor until they can do 1,000,001 hoops. That was dropped during COVID. Any doctor of any specialty who had a pulse and could stand up straight was hired by these contract firms and put into ICUs to run these wards. Okay? Same thing with nurses. And some of these guys couldn't even speak English. And again, there were a lot of doctors in these ICUs that weren't even qualified to be in there. And, I think, everybody knows medicine is specialized. If I'm a podiatrist, I can't work in an ICU. I can't do open heart surgery. And yet that's the kind of insanity that was doing. Same thing with the nurses, but it's even worse. I thought the worst of it was they were taking new grads and putting in the ICUs in charge of these intubated patients. They were taking girls, and they are girls because some of them aren't even 20 yet, and they hadn't even finished their nursing degree, and they put these girls in the ICUs in charge of intubated patients. This was a recipe for murder. They incentivized these hospitals to use these extreme, unscientific, against all medical history, protocols. They shouted down, emotionally browbeat, fired, and some of these nurses had their licenses taken away for calling bullshit on this. Some had their names and their addresses put on the internet so that they could be personally threatened in their homes by trolls. Okay? Yeah, does everybody get this? And here's the most important thing. It's 2023. Why am I the only person talking about this? I'm not. By the way, if you look at the medical, what they're now turning into the medical justice movement, and you can find their sites, and unfortunately, they're fledgling folks. They don't know how to promote. Most have been traumatized, financially devastated. They don't have, you and I are marketers. They don't know how to get the word out. Some examples, Scott Sherrar. Well, entrepreneur, expert marketer, he was able to get his story out. Do you think the average person who's gone through a severe trauma and doesn't actually know fully what happened to them is going to be able to get their story out? No. The point I want to make about it, why is it late? I mean, it's the end of 2023. We're recording this on the 13th of December. Where are the investigative journalists? Where are these people that have been collecting millions and millions of dollars to fight the COVID resistance? I don't know if it's the biggest story, but this is one of the biggest stories in the whole COVID catastrophe. Look, the kids are back in school, so that's done, right? Everybody knows the vaccines are bullshit. I mean, if you don't know that, you really have a low IQ. So most people know the vaccines are dangerous, right? So a lot of problems have been, quote, solved. And the reason I wrote this book, and the reason I'm so grateful that you're listening to me, they're still killing people this way right this minute. And worst of all, this system that they have is in place. They could fire it up with another bullshit diagnosis and run hundreds of thousands of people through it and kill a whole nother batch of people.
I think part of the important thing to understand is who, again, was pushing this, why. I guess money seems to be the big motivator, and, what happens to people that question it. So, you talk about like these reporters or other people that seem to take up the flag. I mean, they seem to become corrupted. I guess they start doing it maybe for a good reason, and then I don't know what the money gets to them, or they.
Here's the thing, this is such a life and death matter. I mean, you and I have speculated about this kind of stuff before, and I'm, normally I'm happy to talk about it. What's going on with these people? Why aren't they doing their jobs? But this is such a life and death matter. I don't think there's any time to even think about these people. We just have to figure out how we get the word out to as many people as possible, so that if somebody finds themselves in a hospital diagnosed with COVID and they're starting to, say, hey, maybe you need BiPAP, maybe you need a sedative. Hey, how about some remdesivir? People don't even know how to protect themselves from that. There's this psychology of you're in a hospital and like yourself over. I mean, the language is like, have you been released yet? It's like, what are you? You're not when you go to a hospital.
Well, you mentioned that actually, under what circumstances is the hospital allowed to keep you there against your will?
Well, they did a whole lot of that because remember, families and caretakers and advocates were not allowed in the hospitals. Mm-hmm. So they could not see what was going on. Sometimes these people were able to communicate slightly with their family members, usually not. Why? They were sedated. Why? There are many cases where they were told, no, you may not intubate this patient. We do not agree. They intubated them anyway. No, you may not give this patient remdesivir. They gave them remdesivir anyway. But these folks were cut off from all humanity. Anybody that cared about them and could do anything about them didn't even know what's going on. I mean, there's so many horrifying things about this, but lots of times somebody would check their loved one in hospital. They wouldn't see them again for weeks or hear from them, and they'd be delivered a body in such bad condition that you can't even believe some of the descriptions I'm hearing from people. Let's talk about the fact that this system was set up. Okay, there were people somewhere at the Washington, D.C. level, there was some group of people that planned this all out. They said, deny them ibuprofen, deny them steroids. Don't even do anything for them unless they have an obvious sickness. Once they come in with an obvious sickness and a positive COVID test, if you check them in, cha-ching, the cash register rings. Then get them on BiPAP, get them upset, give them sedatives. And some of the drugs they were giving these people, I mean, over the top, and then start pushing them to acquiesce to remdesivir, pushing them to acquiesce to ventilation. However, I'm hearing stories about people that were put on remdesivir against their will. They were knocked out with drugs and then given a course of remdesivir.
Jesus.
Okay? You know, this is as dark as it gets. And the scary thing is they're still killing people right now as we speak, less than they killed before because there are less COVID cases. But the thing that I want to emphasize is nobody has exposed this system in a broad way, right, in a way that it's reached public consciousness, and they can fire up this murder machine anytime they want and do it all over again. Look, think of how much time somebody had to sit down and think about, okay, how are we going to incentivize them to use remdesivir? Oh, money. How are we going to incentivize them? Intubation. Money. Okay, we better prohibit them from using all the tried and true ibuprofen and steroids. Check. Hey, there's this thing, ivermectin. By the way, let's let everybody, ivermectin, horse paste, right? Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have given hundreds of millions, if not billions, of doses of ivermectin to Africa over the years. Why? Because it is a dewormer, right? They know damn well it's for human beings, and they know damn well it has a super high safety profile, right? So they were shutting down all these other things. Any nurse that raised her voice was fired. Any doctor that raised his voice was fired. I think more nurses raised their voices than doctors, by the way, by a large margin. And not only were they fired, they had their licenses challenged. And if that wasn't enough, there's a group, you'll love this. There was a group called Team Halo. And we've got the video on our website. The Undersecretary of Communications for the United Nations was praising Team Halo and praising herself for working with Team Halo and TikTok. And what they did was they would certify, experts and put them out there to, fight disinformation. Well, some of the people they certified were issuing death threats against nurses. And fucking TikTok was okay with that. I mean, it's a system, and at some levels, a group of people got together and sorted it out. Here's my thought. Why did they do this? As you know, there is a group of insane people that believe the entire world has to be completely changed from top to bottom. We have to stop burning oil, or what we're supposed to burn instead, I don't know. We have to give up our cars. We have to we have to eat bugs. We can't eat meat. I mean, all this crazy stuff. Two things. One, Americans are expensive people. We do consume a lot of the world's resources. So I can see some of these zealots saying, well, the best way to help the planet is just kill a whole lot of Americans.
Yeah.
And I see this mentality possible even at the federal level. The other thing is a lot, not all, but a lot of the people who were murdered were older and they had some kind of health problem already. These people are expensive to the system. Getting rid of them takes some financial burdens off the system. And I want to give you a historical perspective. One of the first things the Nazis did when they took over was they wanted to know who every Jew was. And with the help of IBM, they built one of the first global databases in Germany. The next thing they did was fire every Jewish physician and nurse in Germany. Can't work in a hospital, can't work at a university, can't work in a public health clinic. And then what did they do? They replaced them with card-carrying Nazi party members. That group, physicians, was the most represented profession of Nazi party members of any profession in Germany. And then they started the Holocaust. And the Holocaust started in hospitals with doctors and nurses killing handicapped infants first, then children, then older people, then just handicapped people in general with lethal injections. This is all history. If you don't know it, it's because People have made a big effort to not tell you, but every legitimate historian that knows this stuff, you can go read their books. The Holocaust began with doctors and nurses killing people. Then it expanded from there. And we have something that looks, is different form, similar outcome. So I hope, if people will get this book, What the Nurses Saw, go to the web address, whatthenursessaw.com. I've got a lot of material there you can check out, but this is as serious as it gets.
Yeah, that's what it seems like, right? Yeah, the beginning is of Nazi Germany. What's the difference? It just amazes me, I guess it shouldn't, that, so many German people went along with what happened in World War II, and now so many people in the U.S. have gone along with what happened with COVID.
Rich, let's look at it this way. Did they go along with it, or was every Jewish doctor and nurse taken out of the profession so they couldn't object, right? The same thing is happening here. Any veteran nurse that stands up and says, hey, I'm not doing this. What are you guys doing? They lose their jobs, and they are replaced by either somebody from overseas who can't speak English, that is not educated to the level of American nurses, and, they just do what they're told. So I think people are resisting. The people who are resisting are being eliminated. The good doctors and nurses were taken out of the German medical system pre-Holocaust. The good doctors and nurses in this country are being, fired, delicensed, and harassed. So people are fighting back, but they're being brutalized by the same people that are trying to impose this system. I wish what I'm saying isn't true. I wish that I was crazy. Somebody could say to me, look, there's no factual basis for what you're saying. The problem is, there is a fact, and you know me, Rich, like I'm a businessman. I've made my money based on understanding reality and acting accordingly. I have no time for fantasies. I have no time for conspiracy theories. I have no time for spinning dark tales. This shit is deathly real. Doing what I'm doing.
I appreciate it, Ken. And like I said, you keep doing it. It's amazing. It's amazing all the things you've uncovered. It's crazy. Just in brief, so in addition to people getting this book, where else now can they find out more about your work?
Forget my work. Get this freaking book and become it and read it. Maybe you don't agree with, maybe 8 veteran nurses were lying. Maybe the respiratory therapist of 20 years was lying. So then consider me not worth listening to. But if you read this thing and you understand it, please be an advocate for this book. That's what's needed more than anything else right now. Let people know about this. Let your family know about this. Let community members that you can trust, who will listen, know about this. The system for a second wave of mass murder has not been turned off. They can flip the switch and turn it back on any time they want. I don't know how many they killed, but I'm sure it's tens of thousands, and it could have been hundreds of thousands. I don't know. I researched to find out how many were on remdesivir, find out how many were put on ventilators who shouldn't have been. And you can get that from the medical records, by the way. Hey, he had 102 fever and he had a little trouble breathing. That person didn't belong on a fucking ventilator. So, by the way, when these families want to get the medical records, and some of these records, the nice thing about the Nazis was they kept good records. That's why we were able to hang physical doctors at the Nuremberg Code. These hospitals have kept pretty good records. The problem is they kill your father, your husband, your grandfather. You go to get the records and they say, we got them. 3,000 pages, $1 a page. It's all the medical records.
Well, very good, Ken. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. And, I'm sure you're going to put out more material, and we'll have you back as soon as you do. So, again, thank you for what you do.
Thanks for having me, brother. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.